Section 28 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Place Names the Place, Part 9. After dinner, when I had retired upstairs with my grandmother, I said to her that the qualities which attracted us in Madame de Villeparisis, her tact, her shrewdness, her discretion, her modesty in not referring to herself, were not perhaps of very great value, since those who possessed them in the highest degree were simply people like Mole and Loménie, and that if the want of them can make our social relations unpleasant, yet it did not prevent from becoming Chateaubriand, Vigny, Hugo, Balzac, a lot of foolish fellows who had no judgment, at whom it was easy to mock, like Bloch. But at the name of Bloch, my grandmother cried out in protest, and she began to praise Madame de Villeparisis. As we are told that it is the preservation of the species which guides our individual preferences in love, and, so that the child may be constituted in the most normal fashion, sends fat men in pursuit of lean women and vice versa. So, in some dim way, it was the requirements of my happiness, threatened by my disordered nerves, by my morbid tendency to melancholy, to solitude, that made her allot the highest place to the qualities of balance and judgment, peculiar not only to Madame de Villeparisis, but to a society in which our ancestors saw blossom in the minds of a Dodon, a Monsieur de Remusat, not to mention in a Beausergent, a Joubert, a Sévigné, a type of mind that invests life with more happiness, with greater dignity than the converse refinements which brought a Baudelaire, a Poe, a Verlaine, a Rimbaud, to sufferings, to a disrepute such as my grandmother did not wish for her daughter's child. I interrupted her with a kiss, and asked her if she had noticed some expression which Madame de Villeparisis had used, and which seemed to point to a woman who thought more of her noble birth than she was prepared to admit. In this way I used to submit my impressions of life to my grandmother, for I was never certain what degree of respect was due to anyone until she had informed me. Every evening I would come to her with the mental sketches that I had made during the day of all those non-existent people who were not her. Once I said to her, I shouldn't be able to live without you. But you mustn't speak like that. Her voice was troubled. We must harden our hearts more than that, you know, or what would become of you if I went away on a journey? But I hope that you would be quite sensible and quite happy. I could manage to be sensible if you went away for a few days, but I should count the hours. But if I were to go away for months? At the bare suggestion of such a thing my heart was wrung. For years, We both remained silent. We dared not look one another in the face, and yet I was suffering more keenly from her anguish than from my own. And so I walked across to the window and said to her, with a studied clearness of tone, but with averted eyes, You know what a creature of habit I am. For the first few days after I have been parted from the people I love best, I am wretched. But though I go on loving them just as much, I grow used to their absence. Life becomes calm, bearable, pleasant. I could stand being parted from them for months, for years. I was obliged to stop and looked straight out of the window. My grandmother went out of the room for something. But next day I began to talk to her about philosophy, and speaking in a tone of complete indifference, but at the same time taking care that my grandmother should pay attention to what I was saying, I remarked what a curious thing it was, that according to the latest scientific discoveries, the materialist position appeared to be crumbling, and the most likely thing to be once again the survival of the soul and reunion in a life everlasting. Madame de Villeparisis gave us warning that presently she would not be able to see so much of us. A young nephew who was preparing for Saumur, and was meanwhile stationed in the neighborhood at Doncières, was coming to spend a few weeks' furlough with her, and she would be devoting most of her time to him. In the course of our drives together, she had boasted to us of his extreme cleverness, and above all of his goodness of heart. Already I was imagining that he would have an instinctive feeling for me, that I was to be his best friend. And when, before his arrival, his aunt gave my grandmother to understand that he had unfortunately fallen into the clutches of an appalling woman with whom he was quite infatuated, and who would never let him go, since I believed that that sort of love was doomed to end in mental aberration, crime, and suicide, thinking how short the time was that was set apart for our friendship, already so great in my heart, although I had not yet set eyes on him, I wept for that friendship and for the misfortunes that were in store for it, as we weep for a person whom we love when someone has just told us that he is seriously ill and that his days are numbered. One afternoon of scorching heat, I was in the dining room of the hotel, which they had plunged in semi-darkness to shield it from the glare, by drawing the curtains which the sun gilded, while through the gaps between them I caught flashing blue glimpses of the sea, when along the central gangway leading inland from the beach to the high road I saw tall, slender, his head held proudly erect upon a springing neck, a young man go past with searching eyes, whose skin was as fair and his hair as golden as if they had absorbed all the rays of the sun. Dressed in a clinging, almost white material such as I could never have believed that any man would have the audacity to wear, the thinness of which suggested no less vividly than the coolness of the dining room the heat, and brightness of the glorious day outside, he was walking fast. His eyes, from one of which a monocle kept dropping, were the color of the sea. Everyone looked at him with interest as he passed, knowing that this young Marquis de Saint-Loup-en-Bray was famed for the smartness of his clothes. All the newspapers had described the suit in which he had recently acted as second to the young Duc d'Uez in a duel. One felt that this so special quality of his hair, his eyes, his skin, his figure, which would have marked him out in a crowd like a precious vein of opal, azure shot and luminous, embedded in a mass of coarser substance, must correspond to a life different from that led by other men. So that when, before the attachment which Madame de Villeparisis had been deploring, the prettiest women in society had disputed the possession of him, his presence, at a watering place, for instance, in the company of the beauty of the season to whom he was paying court, not only made her conspicuous, but attracted every eye fully as much to himself, because of his tone, of his impertinence befitting a young lion, and especially of his astonishing good looks. Some people even thought him effeminate, though without attaching any stigma, for everyone knew how manly he was and that he was a passionate womanizer. This was Madame de Villeparisis' nephew of whom she had spoken to us. I was overcome with joy at the thought that I was going to know him and to see him for several weeks on end, and confident that he would bestow on me all his affection. He strode rapidly across the hotel, seeming to be in pursuit of his monocle, which kept darting away in front of him like a butterfly. He was coming from the beach, and the sea which filled the lower half of the glass front of the hall gave him a background against which he was drawn at full length, as in certain portraits whose painters attempt, without in any way falsifying the most accurate observation of contemporary life, but by choosing for their sitter appropriate surroundings, a polo ground, golf links, a race course, the bridge of a yacht, to furnish a modern equivalent of those canvases on which the old masters used to present the human figure in the foreground of a landscape. A carriage and pair was waiting for him at the door, and while his monocle resumed its gambollings in the air of the sunlit street, with the elegance and mastery which a great pianist contrives to display in the simplest piece of execution, where it has not appeared possible that he could show himself superior to a performer of the second class, Madame de Villeparisis' nephew, taking the reins that were handed him by the groom, jumped on to the box seat by his side, and while he opened a letter which the manager of the hotel sent out after him, made his horses start. What a disappointment was mine on the days that followed, when each time that I met him outside or in the hotel, his head erect, perpetually balancing the movements of his limbs round the fugitive and dancing monocle which seemed to be their center of gravity, I was forced to admit that he had evidently no desire to make our acquaintance, and saw that he did not bow to us, although he must have known that we were friends of his aunt. And calling to mind the friendliness that Madame de Villeparisis and before her Monsieur de Norpois had shown me, I thought that perhaps they were only of a bogus nobility, and that there might be a secret section in the laws that governed the aristocracy, which allowed women, perhaps, and certain diplomats, to discard in their relations with plebeians, for a reason which was beyond me, the stiffness which must, on the other hand, be piteously maintained by a young marquis. My intelligence might have told me the opposite, but the characteristic feature of the silly phase through which I was passing, a phase by no means irresponsive, indeed highly fertile, is that we do not consult our intelligence, and that the most trivial attributes of other people seem to us then to form an inseparable part of their personality. In a world thronged with monsters and with gods, we are barely conscious of tranquility. There is hardly one of the actions which we performed in that phase which we would not give anything, in later life, to be able to erase from our memory. Whereas what we ought to regret is that we no longer possess the spontaneity which made us perform them. In later life, we look at things in a more practical way, in full conformity with the rest of society. But youth was the only time in which we learned anything. This insolence which I surmised in M. de Saint-Loup, and all that it implied of ingrained severity, received confirmation from his attitude whenever he passed us, his body as inflexibly erect, his head always held as high, his gaze as impassive, or rather, I should say, as implacable, devoid of that vague respect which one has for the rights of other people, even if they do not know one's aunt. One example of which was that I did not look in quite the same way at an old lady as at a gas lamp. These frigid manners were as far removed from the charming letters which, but a few days since, I had still been imagining him as writing to tell me of his regard for myself, as is removed from the enthusiasm of the chamber and of the populace which he has been picturing himself as rousing by an imperishable speech, the humble, dull, obscure position of the dreamer, who after pondering it thus by himself, for himself, aloud, finds himself, once the imaginary applause has died away, just the same Tom, Dick, or Harry as before. When Madame de Villaparisis, doubtless in an attempt to counteract the bad impression that had been made on us by an exterior indicative of an arrogant and evil nature, spoke to us again of the inexhaustible goodness of her great-nephew. He was the son of one of her nieces, and a little older than myself. I marveled how the world, with an utter disregard of truth, ascribes tenderness of heart to people whose hearts are in reality so hard and dry, provided only that they behave with common courtesy to the brilliant members of their own sets. Madame de Villaparisis herself confirmed, though indirectly, my diagnosis, which was already a conviction, of the essential points of her nephew's character one day when I met them both coming along a path so narrow that there was nothing for it but to introduce me to him. He seemed not to hear that a person's name was being repeated to him. Not a muscle of his face moved. His eyes, in which there shone not the faintest gleam of human sympathy, showed merely in the insensibility, in the inanity of their gaze, an exaggeration failing which there would have been nothing to distinguish them from lifeless mirrors. Then fastening on me those hard eyes, as though he wished to make sure of me before returning my salute, by an abrupt release which seemed to be due rather to a reflex action of his muscles than to an exercise of will, keeping between himself and me the greatest possible interval, he stretched his arm out to its full extension, and at the end of it offered me his hand. I suppose that it must mean, at the very least, a duel, when next day he sent me his card. But he spoke to me only of literature, declared after a long talk that he would like immensely to spend several hours with me every day. He had not only in this encounter given proof of an ardent zest for the things of the spirit, he had shown a regard for myself which was little in keeping with his greeting of me the day before. After I had seen him repeat the same process whenever anyone was introduced to him, I realized that it was simply a social usage peculiar to his branch of the family, to which his mother, who had seen to it that he should be perfectly brought up, had molded his limbs. He went through those motions without thinking, any more than he thought about his beautiful clothes or hair. They were a thing devoid of the moral significance which I had at first ascribed to them, a thing purely acquired, like that other habit that he had of at once demanding an introduction to the family of anyone whom he knew, which had become so instinctive in him, that seeing me again the day after our talk, he fell upon me, and without asking how I did, begged me to make him known to my grandmother, who was with me, with the same feverish haste as if the request had been due to some instinct of self-preservation, like the act of warding off a blow, or of shutting one's eyes to avoid a stream of boiling water, without which precautions it would have been dangerous to stay where one was a moment longer. The first rites of exorcism once performed, as a wicked fairy discards her outer form and endues all the most enchanting graces, I saw this disdainful creature become the most friendly, the most considerate young man that I had ever met. Good, I said to myself. I've been mistaken about him once already. I was taken in by a mirage. But I have corrected the first only to fall into a second, for he must be a great gentleman who has grown sick of his nobility and is trying to hide it. As a matter of fact, it was not long before all the exquisite breeding, all the friendliness of Saint Loup, were indeed to let me see another creature, but one very different from what I had expected. This young man, who had the air of a scornful, sporting aristocrat, had in fact no respect, no interest save for and in the things of the spirit, and especially those modern manifestations of literature and art which seemed so ridiculous to his aunt. He was imbued, moreover, with what she called socialistic spoutings, and was filled with the most profound contempt for his caste, and spent long hours in the study of Nietzsche and Proust. He was one of those intellectuals, quick to admire what is good, who shut themselves up in a book, and are interested only in pure thought. Indeed, in Saint Loup, the expression of this highly abstract tendency, which removed him so far from my customary preoccupations, while it seemed to me touching, also annoyed me not a little. I must say, when I realized properly who had been his father, on days when I had been reading memoirs rich in anecdotes of that famous Comte de Marsan, in whom were embodied the special graces of a generation already remote, the mind full of speculation, anxious to obtain fuller details of the life that Monsieur de Marsan had led, it used to infuriate me that Robert de Saint Loup, instead of being content to be the son of his father, instead of being able to guide me through the old-fashioned romance of what had been that father's existence, had trained himself to enjoy Nietzsche and Proudhon. His father would not have shared my regret. He had been himself a man of brains who had transcended the narrow confines of his life as a man of the world. He had hardly had time to know his son, but had hoped that his son would prove a better man than himself. And I really believe that, unlike the rest of the family, he would have admired his son, would have rejoiced at his abandoning what had been his own small diversions for austere meditations, and without saying a word, in his modesty as a great gentleman endowed with brains, he would have read in secret his son's favorite authors in order to appreciate how far Robert was superior to himself. There was, however, this rather painful consideration, that if Monsieur de Marsan, with his extremely open mind, would have appreciated a son so different from himself, Robert de Saint Loup, because he was one of those who believe that merit is attached only to certain forms of art and of life, had an affectionate but slightly contemptuous memory of a father who had spent all his time hunting and racing, who yawned at Wagner and raved over Offenbach. Saint Loup had not the intelligence to see that intellectual worth has nothing to do with adhesion to any one aesthetic formula, and had, for the intellectuality of Monsieur de Marsan, much the same sort of scorn as might have been felt for Boileau or Labiche by a son of Boileau or Labiche, who had become adept in the most symbolic literature and the most complex music. "I scarcely knew my father," he used to say. "He seems to have been a charming person. His tragedy was the deplorable age in which he lived. To have been born in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, and to have to live in the days of La Belle Hélène, would be enough to wreck any existence. Perhaps if he had been some little shopkeeper mad about the ring, he'd have turned out quite different. Indeed, they tell me he was fond of literature, but that can never be proved, because literature to him meant such utterly God-forsaken books. And in my own case, if I found Saint Loup a trifle earnest, he could not understand why I was not more earnest still. Never judging anything except by the weight of the intelligence that it contained, never perceiving the magic appeal to the imagination that I found in things which he condemned as frivolous, he was astonished that I, to whom he imagined himself to be so utterly inferior, could take any interest in them. From the first, Saint Loup made a conquest of my grandmother. not only by the incessant acts of kindness which he went out of his way to show to us both, but by the naturalness which he put into them as into everything. For naturalness, doubtless because through the artifice of man it allows a feeling of nature to permeate, was the quality which my grandmother preferred to all others, whether in gardens, where she did not like there to be, as there had been in our Combray garden, two formal borders, or at table, where she detested those dressed-up dishes in which you could hardly detect the foodstuffs that had gone to make them, or in piano playing, which she did not like to be too finicking, too labored, having indeed a special weakness for the discords, the wrong notes of Rubinstein. This naturalness she found and enjoyed even in the clothes that Saint Loup wore, of a pliant elegance, with nothing swagger, nothing formal about them, no stiffness or starch. She appreciated this rich young man still more highly for the free and careless way that he had of living in luxury without smelling of money, without giving himself airs. She even discovered the charm of this naturalness in the incapacity which Saint Loup had kept, though as a rule it is outgrown with childhood, at the same time as certain physiological peculiarities of that period, for preventing his face from at once reflecting every emotion. Something, for instance, that he wanted to have, but had not expected, were it no more than a compliment, reacted in him in a burst of pleasure so quick, so burning, so volatile, so expansive, that it was impossible for him to contain and to conceal it. A grin of delight seized irresistible hold of his face. The too delicate skin of his cheeks allowed a vivid glow to shine through them. His eyes sparkled with confusion and joy, and my grandmother was infinitely touched by this charming show of innocence and frankness, which, incidentally, in Saint Loup, at any rate at the period of our first friendship, was not misleading. But I have known another person, and there are many such, in whom the physiological sincerity of that fleeting blush in no way excluded moral duplicity. As often as not, it proves nothing more than the vivacity with which pleasure is felt, so that it disarms them, and they are forced publicly to confess it, by natures capable of the vilest treachery. But where my grandmother did really adore Saint Loup's naturalness was in his way of admitting, without any evasion, his affection for me, to give expression to which he found words than which she herself, she told me, could not have thought of more appropriate, more truly loving words, to which Sévigné and Beausergent might have set their signatures. He was not afraid to make fun of my weaknesses, which he had discerned with an acuteness that made her smile, but as she herself would have done, lovingly, at the same time extolling my good qualities with a warmth and impulsive freedom that showed no sign of the reserve, the coldness by means of which young men of his age are apt to suppose that they give themselves importance. And he showed in forestalling every discomfort, however slight, in covering my legs if the day had turned cold without my noticing it, in arranging, without telling me, to stay later with me in the evening if he thought that I was depressed or felt unwell. A vigilance which, from the point of view of my health, for which a more hardening discipline would perhaps have been better, my grandmother found almost excessive, though as a proof of his affection for myself, she was deeply touched by it. End of section 28.